Alex Antic, Senator for South Australia with the Liberal Party. Thanks for joining us again on Flow.
Thanks, Ricky.
Today we wanted to catch up with you about the religious freedom reforms that were promised by the Morrison government before the last election. We're getting close to another election. Has there been an update that you've observed there in Canberra?
Yeah, look, there is, Ricky, and your listeners would remember this proposal from around about the time of the Same-Sex Marriage, the Marriage Act amendments, I should say, when it was effectively a promise, I guess, that we would legislate to protect against attacks on religious freedom. So by that we're talking about making it unlawful to discriminate on the basis of religious belief or activity. And of course, you know, that was around the time of the Israel Folau stuff that happened and the Porteous case and all these things that sort of came to light at the one time. So there was a bill prepared. There was a bill by the then Attorney General Porter, who put together a bill back almost 18 months ago. And of course, with the advent of COVID, that slowed it down. The other issue with the bill was it was designed to basically replicate some of the other discrimination acts that we have at federal level, age discrimination, sex discrimination. So it's an interesting juggling act for a centre-right government that's normally, I suppose, a little bit hesitant about that style of legislation. You know, the parties of free speech looking to legislate to effectively, you know, take a piece off that. So it's an interesting dynamic. It's been a very difficult journey, and then on top of COVID coming in to slow that process down. But many of us have had a bit of input into this. I've shared some concerns about the original draft, and I know there's been an enormous input from the various stakeholders across the country. We've got a new Attorney General, and it's now the case that she's hoping, I believe, to bring what is basically a third incarnation, a third rewrite of that bill back before December. And of course, there aren't that many sitting weeks left, so time is of the essence. We do have an election coming up, and many of us are very, very anxious to see this legislated because, you know, as I've said before on your show, I think we are seeing a time now where some of these religious freedoms are on the squeeze, particularly at state level. So I can't tell your listeners yet what the new version looks like. I haven't seen it myself, but I'd be really hopeful, and certainly have been very strongly of the view that things like the conversion therapy legislation in Victoria that's been seen, which your listeners would be aware of, need to be covered off, and the Commonwealth Government can do that. So I'd really like to see this bill come back in a sort of slightly different, but hopefully a format that has some more teeth, because we have to protect these religious freedoms.
Yeah, it's been an incredibly difficult process by the looks of it, because the government's had to go back to the drawing board a couple of times. You've mentioned conversion therapy bills or laws, usually religious or discrimination. In fact, there are laws about religious discrimination in some states. It's usually a state issue. You're saying that the federal government will use, treaty powers or some other power to override state laws?
Yeah, well, I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, and that I assume is part of the problem here. And I don't think that's written in stone, so I shouldn't speculate too much on that. That's something that I'd like to see explored, because what we are seeing at state level is, I think, a creep on some of these religious freedoms. As you said, that conversion or suppression therapy or whatever it's called bill, it's caused so much chaos and concern in Victoria, quite rightly. Is something that is almost, something that the Commonwealth Government should look to address, I think, in this bill. Now, that may not turn out to be the case, but, we're seeing these bills popping up and acts popping up all over various states that I think show once again why this version is so important to get right. It has been a difficult process. It's actually very complicated legislation, because you're talking about things like defining the difference between direct discrimination and indirect discrimination. That is, I say to you, you're not welcome at this place because of your religious beliefs. That's direct discrimination. Or I create the environment in my work where you're just not going to want to be there. That's indirect discrimination. So there's a lot of nuances, very tricky, very technical. Yep. But I'm really hopeful that with the benefit of a bit of extra time, this is going to come out pretty well.
And I understand that the Australian Christian Lobby and other groups like Freedom for Faith have been active, perhaps even around the corridors of Parliament House, trying to get this back on the agenda. Is that the case, that there's been a fair bit of heavy lobbying on the coalition side to get this done before the election?
Well, I think there's been a lot of interest expressed in it generally. I mean, I think one of the things that has been so difficult with this process has been the amount of interest that is in it. And of course, there are different faith denominations as well. We're not talking solely about Christian groups here. We're talking about potentially Muslim groups, Jewish groups, or all other sorts that are interested in this legislation as well. And I think that kind of highlights why it's so difficult, because you are dealing with so many different competing interests and sensitive subjects, of course, very, very sensitive subjects. But look, there has been a lot of interest. There were a lot of submissions in relation to the first incarnation of the bill. That then had a rewrite because of the interest that was in it. And then COVID hit, and here we are again with, I guess, the benefit of 12 months of state legislation to now tip into that pile and examine how the Commonwealth Government can address some of those concerns as well. So it's very, very difficult stuff. It's generated a lot of interest, and it should. It's an important piece of work.
During the marriage debate, the marriage referendum or postal vote was something that Labor Senator Penny Wong, your fellow South Australian senator, said was a platform for homophobia. And I see that Green Senator for Victoria, Janet Rice, described the latest version of this bill when she sees it, hasn't even seen it yet, and she says it's a Trojan horse for hate. Is that what it is?
Trojan horse for hate, colourful language. No, of course it's not. No, this is about protecting people's right to believe, protecting their right to undertake religious activities, and doing so in an environment that covers the field. I mean, I don't think it's very helpful language to describe it in those terms. And of course, we saw that language being used so effectively during the marriage debate. Love is love. The pro-marriage, pro same-sex marriage brigade were very good with that. But equally, I don't think that language is very helpful. I find it very inflammatory. And look, this is simply a piece of legislation that delivers on a promise that was made almost 2 years ago, even more, to protect people's rights to believe what they believe, practice what they practice, and to do so in a manner that doesn't allow them to be cancelled.
Final question, how do you feel this might interface if we have a continuing pandemic and COVID when it comes to something like worship? A lot of churches are being told they can't have singing or they can't even gather. Their religious freedom has not been allowed to proceed during the pandemic, and I know American churches have challenged this. Do you think that it might override even COVID restrictions?
Well, that's again one of the difficulties here is where's the jurisdiction? How much of this does it override into local policing authorities? It's a complicated question, that one. I'm not sure I can answer it. Suffice to say that I think some of those double standards we've seen on certain events getting the green light and church services not getting the green light are very, very troubling. We've seen lots of instances of that overseas. There's that famous footage of the Canadian priest going spare at the police officers, quite rightly. Different jurisdiction. But look, I think the intent is to cover the field as widely as we can without making this too onerous. Once again, politics is the art of the possible, as they say, and we need to be in a position where we can get as much coverage for religious belief as we can without necessarily stepping on too many toes on the way through. So it's a very difficult balancing act. Personally, I'd be very happy to see those sorts of things considered. But actually having the jurisdiction to do them, that's a different story.
Yeah, little wonder we're on to our third draft. Thank you very much, Senator Antic. Have a good day in Canberra today.
Thanks, Ricky.